Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Krewe of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Krewe of Japan podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of Krewe of Japan podcast, the show where Southern charm meets the rising sun. Okay, yeah, I added that in. It's not normally our catchphrase, but hey, let's roll with it. Today, we are kicking off, pun very much intended, a special two-part series that deep dives into one of Japan's biggest passions, soccer. That's right, whether you call it soccer or football, there's no denying that Japan has carved out a unique and thrilling spot in the global game. And in this episode, we're putting a spotlight on the domestic scene. But we're not going to go on this soccer safari alone. In an interview recorded back in February, the crew sat down with Dan Orlowitz, a Japan-based sports journalist and longtime follower of all things Japanese soccer. Dan brings not just the expertise, but pure soccer energy, and trust me, he does not hold back. During our chat, we'll explore the professional soccer landscape in Japan.
Nobody who helped found the J.League in 92-93 could imagine that we'd get to this point where we don't just have a strong top flight, but a really strong second flight that's stacked with J1 level teams, and then a really competitive third flight. So it's a testament to how far the league has come and how far soccer has spread across Japan that you're covering 43 of the 47 prefectures.
Which clubs have the most silverware, rowdiest fans, and the deepest roots in Japanese culture?
Urawa Reds, who have historically boasted the biggest support among any Japanese club. One of those things where they're in Saitama, there's not really much else to do in Saitama but support the big J.League team, and you had an ultras culture there where they're looking at what Europe did and they said, well, let's do that. And Urawa boys have been really, really good at that. They are also the supporters with the most incidents among J.League clubs.
Which soccer stars are lighting up the league right now that should be on your radar?
It's so hard to define that these days because the biggest problem is that all the good players are going to Europe when they turn 21 or 22. Like, the result of that is that a lot of the faces of the clubs are players who are veterans and they've been to Europe and they've come back. And now they are leading their teams, but also serving as sort of mentors to the next generation.
And so much more. We're just getting warmed up from the behind-the-scenes structure of the J.League to fan culture, fierce rivalries, and the future faces of Japanese soccer. We cover a ton in this episode. So grab your kit, lace up your cleats, pour yourself a Pocari Sweat, and settle in. Because whether you're a diehard J.League fan or just getting curious about soccer in Japan, this is one match you won't want to miss. Let's go. Are you new to the crew? Yokoso! We hope you enjoy this episode. If you like what you hear today, then you'll really love our back catalog of episodes from earlier this season and previous seasons. We've had some incredible guests, like castle expert William DeLong mapping out Japanese castles, journalist and author of Tokyo Vice Jake Adelstein investigating Yakuza, Dr. Kate Kitagawa of JAXA blasting off a conversation on the Japanese space program, and so much more. After you finish up this episode, hit that subscribe button or follow or whatever it is, and get notified when new episodes come out. Then while you wait for the new episode to drop, play catch up with the crew. But before you do any of that, let's dive into today's episode. All right, so today I'm here not with Jennifer, but with Nigel. Nigel, what's up, man?
What's up? What's up?
A long time since you've been here for an interview.
I know. This is awesome, and I'm actually super excited. I think maybe we've talked about it before, but I'm actually a huge soccer fan. And of course, saying soccer, of course, is going to split, a lot of people listening to this, but football, I will properly recognize it as football. Although I think Japan actually refers to it as soccer. So in this context, that is actually more correct.
Yeah, so today we are talking about men's soccer in Japan, the professional league and international play and all that fun stuff. While Nigel's a big soccer fan and I occasionally watch soccer, mostly during the World Cup, but, here or there I might turn on a match. We decided to bring in an expert, someone who is well-versed in not just soccer/football, but also J.League and the Japanese soccer scene. So we have with us sports writer and freelancer Dan Orlowitz. Dan, how you doing?
I'm good. Good morning, good evening, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon and good night. Happy to be here.
Awesome. We're happy to have you. So before we jump into the soccer content, we always ask our guests one question at the beginning of every episode, and that's if you have or have not been to New Orleans before, or if you haven't, what's something that you think of when you hear New Orleans? Based off of what you're wearing, I may know one thing that you think of, but I'll let you tell that.
Yeah, so I have not been. I think my family have gone over a couple times. I've not been myself. A bunch of about 50 or so of my friends did go the other week, go Birds. And, I think they did pretty well. They took home some nice shiny hardware as a souvenir. They possibly buried Patrick Mahomes out there in one of those above ground crypts that you have down there. I have watched the Beignet episode of Binging with Babish probably about 100 times. I aspire to make those one day. So I will admit that my New Orleans connection is not very strong. But hey, when Philadelphians go down to New Orleans, we leave an impact, I think.
We had to grease the poles, but that was probably for Mardi Gras, not for the Super Bowl. But maybe it was. Maybe it was part of that prep, just in case.
So actually, I watched the Super Bowl. There is a Philly-themed izakaya over here called Nihonbashi Philly, and they make arguably the best cheesesteaks in Asia and possibly as good as you'll get in Philadelphia itself. And so I've become good friends with the owners. I sort of accidentally caused them to go viral and become massive over in Philly. And that's a story for another time. But we're in this bar I got there at 6 a.m. There's a line going down the block. People who had been lined up since 4:30. I've been told, we get in there. You have 100 Eagles fans just packing the place. They took out all the tables and chairs, and it was just massive. And afterwards, the owners, so it's the husband and wife who own the place, and the wife actually led us on a victory parade down to the bridge in Nihonbashi, carrying this, these Eagles flags while everyone's doing the chants and the fight song and all that. So that's, I think that sort of represents everything that you guys are about in a way, and that we love to see, which is, that positive sort of cultural interaction. It's not about where you're from. It's about what you love.
I love that you guys had a parade on a Monday morning in downtown Tokyo.
You know what? And my first viral skeet on Blue Sky got video of someone climbing the lamppost outside the restaurant after the game ended. Proud moment for me right there. It went so viral, my junior high math teacher saw it and DM'd me. And I was like, oh, wow, people have seen this, doing numbers. So that was a good moment.
Awesome. Well, enough with football, American football. Let's shift over to you and Japan and soccer. So, Nigel, take it away.
Yeah. So I guess just, right off the bat, sounds like you're from Philadelphia and somehow you ended up in Japan covering Japanese soccer, sports, and maybe even a little bit more beyond that these days as well. So one of the things we often like to, ask right out of the gate, besides what's your connection to New Orleans, is what's your Japan journey? How did you get interested in Japan and eventually end up traveling there to do what you do now?
Well, it all starts, as it does with, I think, a lot of people my age, with anime. Good friend recommended a series to me, and I think it was 2001 or so, and I fell down the rabbit hole. And so the first series I watched was Serial Experiments Lane.
I vaguely remember that, yeah.
It is a super deep cut, but it is actually very relevant to today's social media landscape and interpersonal connectivity and sort of what it means to be a part of your community, and very relevant watch in the year of our Lord 2025. So that was the first series I watched. The first series I purchased, blind, no knowledge of what was in the box, was Neon Genesis Evangelion. A classic, blitzed it all in like 2 nights, and that really just locked me in. And I was involved in the local convention scene. I went to college in Western Massachusetts at a small liberal arts school called Simon's Rock College, and so my home con was Anime Boston. I did some panel stuff. I staffed at a con in New Hampshire. I Kineticon in Hartford, Bakuretsu-kan up in Vermont. Like I was in that community.
Okay.
And junior year came around, and my college, it was an AA, BA program, and they said, like, well, for your third year, one of the rules is that you do have to either do an independent study or go abroad for at least a semester. And I'm 18. I've got no better idea than I'll go to Japan for a year. This makes sense. And I did that as a Philadelphian through Temple University because they have a campus right in Tokyo. So study abroad in Tokyo at in-state tuition rates, like, of course that makes sense. So I did a year there. This was 04, 05, fell in love with it. And, when I went back, I knew I was going to come back to Tokyo. And so the plan was, well, I'll go back, I'll graduate, I'll go back to Tokyo to do language school for a couple of years, and I'll figure out the rest later. And that was 18 years ago that, I went to language school. I became kind of a C or D list celebrity in the punk scene here, doing photography and working with some bands. I was sort of an English supervisor for a couple acts that were kind of festival popular. That's another chapter of my life. But as I'm doing that, my first spring here, I had seen a copy of Metropolis magazine back when they published weekly. And they had listings for whatever was happening that weekend. And I saw, FC Tokyo are hosting a game in Tokyo on, I think it must have been Golden Week 2007. And so I go there with my little, DSLR camera. I had no idea what I was doing or what I was going to experience, but I ended up behind the goal and I just fell in love with it. And as someone who grew up in Philly before Philly had a Major League Soccer team, I wasn't connected to club soccer. I played, in junior high. I played in elementary school. But our age, I think we watched it every 4 years at the World Cup or maybe the Olympics. Like, you couldn't turn on NBC at 10 in the morning and watch a Premier League game. So that was my first exposure to club soccer. And being from Philly, you have that. There's a very strong identification with our sports teams. And it's a very proud 4-for-4 city. And FC Tokyo were not that good that season. It was a very bad season, but you had the vibe among the supporters behind the goal, and you had the chants and the songs and everything, and it was just so easy to get swept up into. And from there, I joined, there was a community of other foreigners who lived in other cities and supported other teams. And we had our forums, the Rising Sun Forum on the Japanese Soccer Forum on Big Soccer. And we all had our blogs where we're writing about the team, writing about match day experiences, that sort of thing. And that eventually, a couple years later, we all moved to Twitter. And that's where the community really starts growing and getting sort of outside exposure. I ended up joining goal.com. At the time, the biggest soccer website in the world. Maybe today, I don't know. But I joined it as a desk writer on the Asian desk in the international edition. So started there, worked my way up. I eventually moved to a couple Japanese outlets. I was doing stats work, writing columns, doing photography, eventually getting accreditation and going to these games and covering these games. So that's a 10-minute explanation of how I got here. But basically, so over time, I just became one of a handful of people who covered the league professionally. There's only really 2 or 3 of us foreigners who are going to these games regularly and writing stuff. And I joined the Japan Times in the summer of 2018. And that was sort of my big step up. And I was there for about 5.5 years. And I went freelance last year. And now I'm sort of doing a bit of everything. And the cool thing about working at the paper was that I could not just cover soccer, but anything really. There weren't that many of us at the sports desk. So sort of you put your hand up. And if there's time, you go and cover things. So I covered figure skating. I covered rugby. I covered basketball. I did a big feature on quad ball, which used to be known as Quidditch. I did Formula One. And the interesting thing is that my background in anime and especially anime fan culture has informed a lot of what I get to write about the cultures of these other sports, because there's a lot of similar behaviors, a lot of overlapping threads in terms of the cultures and what the fans do and how they express their support for their favorite teams or athletes or whatever. You see the same thing when it comes to how clubs and teams and leagues market themselves and what they're using to do that. So another culture writer, Patrick St. Michel, who's one of the best Japanese music writers out there, former guest, and he may have said it on your show, but everything is anime in a way, and everything is AKB48, and it's the same in sports. I'm less interested in the X's and O's than I am in sort of using Japanese sports as a way to explain Japanese culture and to introduce Japanese culture to people who want to learn about it. And I think that if you look at Shohei Ohtani, you see the greatest baseball player of all time. But if you look at what created Shohei Ohtani, if you look at the high school baseball system, if you look at why the NPB is what it is, you see so much more. It's not just a one-way mirror, it's a two-way mirror. Like, you can look and you can see whatever you want to see, but if you look a little deeper, you can spot some really interesting stuff. And that's true of sumo, that's true of basketball, it's true of rugby, that's true of American football. Japan has just all these cool sporting subcultures that nobody knows exists. And then when you find out they do exist, you look a little deeper, there's just so much cool stuff. I mean, I just did a 2,000 word feature on competitive dance here, and it's the coolest thing in the world. It's by Roman Empire now. So we've drifted away from soccer a bit, but the J.League is just such a cool league, and there's such an amazing culture that's been built here over 30 plus years, and even going to way before the J.League started, that, you could write a bajillion books about it and not get everything.
Yeah, well, so you brought up multiple sports just now when you're talking about all these subcultures that exist. Comparatively, soccer versus baseball or basketball, would you consider it like the most popular sport in Japan? I know baseball right now is booming with Shohei Ohtani, and
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been popular in Japan. It's been popular for a long time. But where does soccer fit in with the hierarchy of maybe like the popularity of sports?
If you're looking at team sports, baseball is still number one just by virtue of the media exposure that it has and the audience that it has built in. The important thing about baseball, if you look at who owns the teams, the Yomiuri Giants, that's, Japan's biggest media syndicate, the Yomiuri Shimbun and Nippon Television and all these things. Chunichi Dragons, another big newspaper. You have major railways, Hanshin and Seibu and all these gigantic companies. So they already have such built-in media exposure, and those fan bases have been developed over 60, 70, 80 years.
Right.
And, it's an older men's sport. It's something you go after work with the boys to have a couple beers and watch the Giants play. Whereas soccer, the J.League is a once a weekend thing. You're playing 38 rounds versus 140 or so regular season games. So the exposure isn't there as much. And so in that sense, yes, the J.League is sort of second to NPB. But if you look at the studies of sports that students are getting into, soccer is overwhelmingly more popular than baseball among kids.
I was about to say, I feel like when I was teaching, I taught elementary school for a while, and everyone played soccer. Like, everyone played soccer. And my wife's friends, they have kids in junior high and high school, and all of them play soccer. You would think, though, with the way that high school baseball is covered in Japan, it's probably similar to how high school football is covered in the US in that regard. The tournament towards the end of the year gets big coverage. But yeah, I feel like soccer is definitely, in younger audiences and younger players, I feel like it's definitely more widespread in terms of its reach.
It's also just easier to get into. I mean, if you're playing baseball, you have to buy the glove and you have to have the bat. You need to get the kid to batting practice. There's a lot of built-in costs.
It's true.
In baseball that aren't necessarily there in soccer. Where you just need cleats and shin guards and a very patient mom who will, make sure that you get to club practice every day. Yeah. And yes, when you think of high school baseball and youth baseball, you think of Koshien, which is insane. But I will also say, look at the All Japan National High School Soccer Championship, which takes place from late December through about mid-January. Those games sell out. And they're not just playing on high school pitchers or whatever. They're playing at J.League stadiums. The final takes place at the National Stadium or Saitama Stadium in the last 10 or so years, and they will sell 50, 60,000 tickets to that, to watch high school kids play. It's an insane thing. But that's a testament to how successful the Japanese soccer community has been at developing things down to the grassroots. Those roots are really entrenched now, and they're watering in all the right places because it is a system that continues to produce amazing players. 30 years ago, all of Japan's national team players were coming out of high schools. Now you have J.League teams who have the academy systems going down to elementary school levels. You have schools and then junior youth teams and then youth teams and then academy teams. And so those clubs are producing the majority of players who are going on to eventually play for the national team. But the high school system is still producing bangers. And you look at like Chase Henry, who went to Stuttgart directly out of high school. Now you don't just have kids who are going pro to the J-League straight out of high school. You have kids who are going to Europe straight out of high school. And there's a lot that we could get into there. And I think it may be a bit too niche for this discussion, but like there's a lot there in terms of how culturally the youth pipeline is set up and what players were looking to get out of it 30 years ago versus what they are now. But it's incredible. And so I think that baseball has its own issues. They're worried about wearing these kids out, especially with the pitch counts these days. And there's a lot of consternation among the high school baseball community over what to do there. But the reality is that baseball participation has been going down and soccer participation has been going way, way up. And even other sports, basketball's enjoying a huge boom these days. And so I think you're starting to see more interest in high school basketball and even junior high basketball as a result, which, of course, if you've ever talked about slam dunk on your show, that was a massive thing. And slam dunk is a reason that basketball is so big in Asia. Yeah, that influenced an entire generation in China and Hong Kong and Taiwan and all those places. So I hope I've answered a question. I think soccer is popular. The national team sells out everything. The J-League last year was its largest attendance ever. The per game average of the J1 isn't quite what it was in 2019. And I can get into sort of the nitty gritty of why, but it's not that far off. So it's super popular, and it seems like for now it's going to keep getting popular.
Yeah, and we actually absolutely will get into the nitty gritty of why, because I definitely want to know. But before we do that, before I move on to the next question, I do just want to unpack a few things you said. And so one interesting thing, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the competitive system in Japan, like competitive European leagues, they have their own domestic cups. And like the Emperor's Cup, for example, is one where I guess if you were trying to align it to be what's this most similar to for maybe some of our listeners, I would say maybe like the FA Cup in England. Is that a fair assessment?
In fact, the original Emperor's Cup trophy was presented by England's FA.
No way.
The story is that there was a news article, might have even been either the Japan Times or whatever the equivalent was back then, or Kyoto's English. Some newswire put out a story that suggested that Japan had established a national championship. Japan had not established a national championship, but the story got some facts wrong. The England's FA hears of this, and they decide to congratulate the Greater Japan Football Association by sending them a trophy. And when the JFA received that trophy, they said, well, I guess we do need an Emperor's Cup. And that's how the Emperor's Cup started in 1921. The National High School Championship actually predates the Emperor's Cup by about 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
So there is the Emperor's Cup, which is equivalent to the FA Cup. It is the same principle. There is the J-League YVC Louvain Cup, which is just the League Cup. And of course, there is the J-League, which is the J1, the J2, and the J3.
Right.
Below that is the JFL, which is the national amateur competition. And then below that, you have about 7 regional leagues, each with 1 or 2 divisions. And then below that is prefectural leagues. And below that, it's city leagues.
Yeah. Now, I could be wrong here, but one of the things that I think is pretty interesting, if true, maybe you can help me confirm this, is that, and this kind of goes back to what you were talking about with Japan developing the grassroots level of things, is that the Emperor's Cup is open to not only just, the professional J1, J2, J3, JFL, but even universities and high schools can sometimes make it.
The way that it works is that, yes, it used to be that open until I want to say it was about 5 or 6 years ago. High school and even reserve teams could participate in the Emperor's Cup. And the qualification system was that every J1 and J2 team got in. The JFL champion also got an automatic bid. Then you had 47 prefectural representatives. 47 prefectures in Japan. So each prefecture has a qualifying tournament, and those can be anyone. Those tournaments even include J3 teams. J3 teams don't qualify automatically. They have to go up through this tournament. And so if you look at some of the older Emperor's Cup brackets from the 2000s and the early 2010s, you will see high school teams get in there. In fact, a high school team once made it to I want to say the round of 16 or even the quarterfinals. Like,
Wow.
they took Yokohama F. Marinos to penalties.
Oh my
Insane
gosh.
thing. There was something where I think Kashiwa Rachel's under 18s actually played the senior team in like the second round once. So this stuff used to happen, but a few years back, the JFA decided that youth teams, underage groups, could not participate anymore. So that meant no more high schools, no more reserve teams or youth teams, but university teams can still qualify. And in fact, we've had university teams beat multiple J.League teams to get to like the round of 16. You may know Kaoru Mitoma, a national team star now at Brighton. His University of Tsukuba team knocked off like 3 J-League teams in a row to get to the round of 16 or something like that. I forget what year exactly it was, but
was that while he was playing?
That he was there. Yeah, he was still a university player. So it doesn't happen as often. I think these days the tournament is set up in a way that does, favor the J-League teams. And so we don't get as many upsets as we used to. But yeah, you'll get these amateur clubs once in a while who will, make a splash. Honda FC, famously known as sort of one of the best amateur club in Japan. The only reason that they're not pro is that Honda as a company just doesn't want it to be pro. They sort of have a point to prove about how they believe that like you can balance your athletic goals and dreams while still being a company man. For them, it's about encouraging employees to be healthy and that sort of thing. They've knocked off countless J-League teams in their history in the tournament.
Wow.
And so actually this year, the JFA, they have to keep switching up the bracket because of the number of J-League teams has kept increasing over the years, and they have to tweak the numbers. So the amateur seed this year is going to some university. I forget exactly what it is, but the reason they got it is because of all the amateur teams in last year's tournament. University teams went the furthest. And so the National University Soccer Federation was given the amateur seed, and they were able to nominate whoever they wanted. So interesting shakeup from the JFA. The Emperor's Cup, it isn't as fun as England's FA Cup. The big issue is that the amateur teams don't have grounds that they can host J-League teams at generally. So, you have to play it at neutral stadiums or at the J-League's home ground. And that's not nearly as fun. It's not like you don't have Tottenham going to somewhere with, a 3,000 seat stadium.
Right.
That's the magic of the cup.
Right.
Conversely, the J-League with its League Cup has started to make it so that lower seeded teams host. So you have J1 teams going to play J3 sides at their home. And that's giving those fans a completely different experience. So
yeah, absolutely.
Japan is starting to get it. I know that was a very long-winded answer to what you may have expected was a shorter question, but
I'm here for it. Like I said, I live, eat, sleep, breathe soccer, so it's all good to me. And it kind of reminds me of one of the leagues that I follow a lot is really the Serie A, the Italian league. And, the past few seasons, you've seen teams like Como and, Venezia sneak in, and these stadiums that only seat, like you said, maybe 5 to 10,000 people. And then you have like a Juventus or an AC Milan come to town. It's an incredible spectacle for everyone in the town. So that's really awesome. But we've kind of already touched on what my next question was going to be, which was really looking at the J-League. We've already talked about the structure, but for a lot of our listeners, they may know, of course, Japan has a professional soccer league. By now, they probably have caught that it's called the J-League, but we actually are recording this in late February, which is actually the perfect time if you're wanting to get into the J-League, because I think they just wrapped up match day 2 this weekend. So unlike other leagues where you're starting typically in the fall, the J-League seems to have a different schedule, which I think is like a February to December schedule. So it keeps you, occupied kind of maybe strategically while the other seasons are ending. You still have the J-League to tune into, which is kind of nice. But overall, for someone who is, let's say, new to Japanese soccer, how would you rank the league in terms of the strength of the league? If we're looking at, of course, people traditionally think of Europe, the top 5 leagues in Europe, as being the strongest in the world. But in recent times, we've seen a lot of players, like the ones that come to mind. We've already talked about Mitoma. We have Indo at Liverpool, Tomiyasu at Arsenal. You have Minamino was at Liverpool, but now it's at Monaco. Kubo in Spain. All these different players who are coming from the J.League. What does that actually say about the strength of the league itself?
I am very bullish on the J-League strength overall. I think obviously you can't quite compare it to the top 5 of Europe. But if you're looking at the second tier of European leagues, Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, Austria, maybe Austria isn't even second tier, but that level, the J-League is a great match. I think any J-League team could hold its own in, say, the English Championship, where you're starting to see a lot of Japanese players. You have a league that's grown. It started with 10 teams in 1993. It hit 60 teams a couple years ago. 3 divisions, full promotion and relegations, not just between the J-League divisions, but now between the J3 and the JFL. So the pyramid has been connected at all steps, which is an incredible accomplishment. These are teams, some of them have only been formed in the last 20, 30 years. Some of them have histories going all the way back to being corporate clubs that were established in the 50s and 60s. Mitsubishi had a team. Sanfrecce Hiroshima used to be Toyo, and then then it became Mazda, and then it became, now it's owned by Edion. Gamba Osaka were formerly Matsushita, now known as Panasonic globally. So you have this combination of former corporate clubs that still carry a lot of that history and newer clubs that have been formed over in recent decades, some by companies as backers, but a lot of teams that are even formed by communities, owned in part or in whole by the local municipalities. Matsumoto Yamaga is basically owned by the city. Vegalta Sendai is I think, the city of Sendai owns a huge chunk of that club. And so you have community clubs that have gone and reached the highest level in Japan. And you've named 4 or 5 Japanese players who are doing very well in Europe. There's something close to, at this point, 80 or 90 Japanese players who are playing in top European leagues. And by that, I mean your top 5, your second tier top divisions, and, English first, like EFL level.
Yeah.
I would be lying if I said I could keep up with all of them. None of us can. Yeah. Like, you look at 20, 30 years ago when Hidetoshi Nakata and Shinji Ono and Shinsuke Nakamura were, like, in many ways the only Japanese players in Europe. And they had dozens of reporters following them around everywhere. And now you can't do it. In many ways, it's not as special to go to Europe. There's 15 players in Germany. There's 15 or 20 Japanese players in Belgium. There's more than half a dozen in England now. You have a bunch in Scotland. You have a bunch in Portugal. And so it's really grown. I do think that Japan has proven, yes, the national team players are based in Europe, but they were all developed by the J-League. So if you're judging it from that, if you're judging it through Japan's accomplishments in the Asian Champions League, if you're judging it by Japan's accomplishments at the World Cup, I think the J-League stands up pretty well at a competitive level. And I think if you look at how the league is operated, how the clubs are managed, the culture that is being developed, I don't think it loses to a lot of countries out there. I think that a lot of Europeans might turn their noses and say, well, you've only been around for 30 years. Why do you have supporters who are using Italian and Argentinian and Brazilian chants and pretending to be ultras and all that stuff? But you know what? Among the best atmospheres in the world. Like, you can't go to a J-League game and have a terrible experience. Like, by that metric, the fact that they've built up soccer culture from just the swamps of obscurity to where it is now, that's massive.
Yeah. Absolutely.
By those metrics, I think it's just been a wildly successful league.
Yeah. And one last thing I'll throw in there before I hand it over to you, Doug, is, like you just kind of hinted on, what's even more incredible is that the league was officially first season in 1993. So you're talking in an incredibly short amount of time, of course, compared to some of the older leagues in in Europe and all. But the level of intensity and where the league is now, I think, speaks volumes of how much intentional effort has gone into it. But yeah, so Doug, sorry, I don't want to steal from your question, but go for it.
Seriously, I'm like, what is the lower J-League? It's J-League 3 is lower, right?
Yep.
There's
And I'm
one,
like
two,
the
three,
community, like the city league. I'm like way down when it comes to fandom of soccer. You guys are geeking out, and I'm like, explain it like I'm five guy over here. So I'm gonna take it a step back and ask about just in general with the J League current state and historically, what are the biggest teams, like the most popular teams amongst serious and casual fans? Because I know, again, obviously there's a big sense of pride with, especially like you were saying, there's city-owned teams and things like that, teams in certain areas. I mean, we have that all around the world, right? I mean, New Orleans and Philadelphia sports fans are all very passionate about their own sports. But what teams are kind of like the big names, the big ones that like internationally recognized, and maybe not internationally, but like just they're always on TV? And then also, who are some of the biggest stars currently in J League?
There's two ways to describe who the biggest teams are. And I think that one way is you look at the OG, the original 10, as we call it, the teams that were first around when the J League was founded. And of those, you have Kashima Antlers, who are based in the god's asshole of Ibaraki Prefecture. Like, it's just totally amazing team, amazing culture. The only problem is that it doesn't matter where you live in Tokyo, the stadium is 3 hours away.
It's hard to get to, yeah.
So hard to get to.
But the most successful team.
Most successful team domestically in terms of J-League titles, in terms of cups. They have won the Champions League before. Historically, they started with Zico, one of Brazil's best ever players.
Yeah.
And he came on before they professionalized, when they were still Sumitomo Metals SC or whatever they called it. But he helped them professionalize. You know, there's all these anecdotes about how he would go out onto the pitch with a ruler and tell the groundskeeper how short to cut the grass. He would stay up all night in the team dorm room to catch his teammates who wanted to sneak out for like a snack at the convenience store or a cigarette. Like, obviously, he was one of the biggest stars of that era, used to a level of professionalism that did not exist in Japan yet. And so it was players like him who helped instill that in Japan back, before Japan considered itself to be a professional soccer country. And so Kashima has always been sort of at the forefront of bringing in amazing Brazilian players who have gone on to contribute massively. There's a reason that we call Kashima Stadium the house that Zico built.
Nice. Wow.
For every game, the supporters have the giant pullover flag that's just Spirit of Zico. You know, his statue is outside the stadium. And so they are, if I were to make a very rough comparison, kind of the Manchester United in a way. I mean, that level.
Yeah.
As close as we'll get to sort of a Barcelona, or maybe not Real Madrid, but it's a club that has a philosophy and an identity, and they may not be successful in implementing that, but they believe it. They have something they believe in. So they're sort of the leaders of that original generation, and you're looking at Yokohama F. Marinos, who are owned by Nissan and now in part by City Football Group. So they're a part of the Manchester City family. City Football Group owns a little less than 20% of the club. And they've also, they've produced a ton of national team stars. They've won, how many championships are they up to? 5? I think, including most recently Kevin Muscat and then, of course, Ange Postecoglou, who both won J-League titles as managers. And look at where Ange ended
huge.
up.
Yeah,
So
Tottenham,
you have them, you have
wow.
Urawa Reds, who have historically boasted the biggest support among any Japanese club. One of those things where they're in Saitama, there's not really much else to do in Saitama but support the big J-League team. And you had an ultras culture there where they're looking at what Europe did and they said, well, let's do that. And Urawa boys have been really, really good at that. They are also the supporters with the most incidents among J-League clubs. They did not participate in last year's Emperor's Cup because they were kicked out for a pitch invasion the previous year.
Oh, wow.
There
Nice.
was the famous Japanese-only banner that resulted in a closed-door game back in 2013, maybe 2014. God, I was at that game. I should remember what year it was. But incidents, but you look at the tifos they produce. Like, no other team in the J.League can do a stadium-wide card display with banners and everything every single game.
Wow.
You look at the displays and it's just absurd. That's the older school. Then you get into sort of the second and third generations of J.League teams who emerged when the J2 was launched in 1999. And you have Kawasaki Frontale, who had this last 7-8 years a dynasty in the J.League.
Golden State Warriors like dynasty.
Pretty much. They won in 2017 and 2018, and then they did it again in 2020 and then 2021. In 2020, they had probably the most stacked squad in the history of the J.League. I mean, you're sending on Kaoru Mitoma as a super sub in the 50th minute. That's sickening. Like, Kaoru Mitoma subbing off Akihito Ienaga, like, that's disgusting. Like, you should have to spend 2 subs to do that. Like, absurd.
Yeah.
No, he should have been the 2020 MVP, and I will die on that hill. Oh, Michael Lunga scores 30-something goals. Let's give it to him. No. Kashiwa Reysol finished, like, 8th that season. Absurd. And Kawasaki have amazing community relationships. They had such a good events team for like match day promotions and something that Tokyo 2020 poached them. And then the pandemic happened, which kind of sucked. But like they would do stuff like have Toyota would do a sponsored day and run Formula One cars around the track. They have a sumo day where they'd actually have Rikishi doing demonstrations outside the stadium. The new main stand is beautiful. I'd say new, it's 10 years old at this point. They're about to start rebuilding the rest of the stadium to match, and what they're going to do is actually pull in the pitch and get rid of the track. So when they finish that project in like 2032 or 33, it's going to be the best stadium in Japan.
Wow.
You have FC Tokyo, who have built up a huge following. That is, sort of the team I rep, despite only winning the 3 cups in their history. 3? Yeah, or 4. 3 League Cups and 1 Emperor's Cup. More recently, you have Vissel Kobe, who have won the last 2 J.League titles, and they have done so because they were purchased by Rakuten in the early 2000s. Mikitani did his thing and spent a ton of money and rebranded the team. And
brought in Iniesta. Brought in
Podolski, brought in
players,
and it didn't work because I'll tell you, he barely played any time in 2023 when they won it. The reason they won it is because they finally got smart about their signings and brought in former national team players, but still sort of top level for Japan, like Yoshinori Muto, Yuya Osako, like that tier of player. And deservedly, they've won the last 2 seasons. You have Sanfrecce Hiroshima, who have just an incredibly stacked squad. Their stadium opened last year, and it is as good as any stadium in Europe. You have Machida Zelvia, who are sort of upstarts.
Yeah, that's wild. What a season.
Super upstarts on the back of a ton of investment by CyberAgent, which is a major player in digital advertising. They run a big streaming service here. So they've just poured a ton into this team, and it's paying off because they got to the J1 last year, and they nearly won the damn thing. They slipped midseason, and they finished 3rd, which is still a huge accomplishment for a first-time J1 team. So that's sort of the 2 tiers. And you also have, Tokyo Verdy are back in the J1. They finally got back last year for the first time in well over a decade. And they did pretty well. They finished 6th or so. So you have 3 teams in Tokyo, and they're all sort of, in many ways, Verdy were around at the start of the J.League, but they've been irrelevant for the last 15 years. So in many ways, they're kind of a new team, but with the legacy of an old team. And below that, you have RB Omiya Ardija, the latest addition of the Red Bull family. And they got promoted from the J3 to the J2 last year, and they'll probably be back in the J1 next year. So you do have this combination of legacy clubs that are backed by these long and storied histories, and newer clubs that are backed by companies in more modern industries, tech especially, software, internet, all that stuff, and soft drinks or energy drinks. And they're pouring in a bunch of money and getting teams here a different way. So it's a good mix, and obviously we're looking at what Red Bull does to see how that affects teams in the future. But I think that that's a good way to define the big teams in Japan.
I was hoping you would mention where I used to live in Iwaki, and Iwaki FC I know there were J3, another J2.
Right, and they Under
But
Armour
yeah.
is
Yeah.
has invested a lot into them.
Right by my apartment, they
Yep.
built a big ass facility and everything. They
Mhm.
used to have the training grounds were right next to it, and then they play in a different area of town. But I've never been. I go back every summer to visit my wife's family, and I catch up with friends, and her family lives not too far from Milwaukee. So I could, but every time it's timing wise, I just end up missing. Like when I'm there, they're away or kind of far away. So,
Check it out. I hope that maybe it
Yeah.
works out this summer because even in the J2, you're going to catch so many really good clubs. I think that one of the benefits of the J League's growth is that the J3, back when it started, was a bunch of sort of aspiring J League clubs and some under 23 teams that the J1 clubs were running as sort of an Olympic related thing just to give younger players more playing time. And now J3 is stacked. The J3 is insane because you have, yes, a lot of J2 level scrubs, but you have Matsumoto Yamaga, who used to play in the J1. You have, Gate Advance Kitakyushu and Kagoshima United, who used to play in the J2. You have FC Gifu, who used to play in the J2. Zueigen Kanazawa used to play in the J2. And so now it's a super competitive third division, which nobody who helped found the J League in 92, 93 could imagine that we'd get to this point where we don't just have a strong top flight, but a really strong second flight that's stacked with J1 level teams, and then a really competitive third flight. So it's a testament to how far the league has come and how far soccer has spread across Japan that you're covering 43 of the 47 prefectures. They're filling in that bingo card. They've almost got the whole map.
Wow. So with that in mind, to the extent that there is one, is there a face of the league? You look around, every league kind of has, those main players that we're tuning in to watch them and their matches. Is there a player or two or three for the J League?
It's so hard to define that these days because the biggest problem is that all the good players are going to Europe when they turn 21 or 22. The
Okay.
result of that is that a lot of the faces of the clubs are players who are veterans and they've been to Europe and they've come back. And now, they are leading their teams, but also serving as sort of mentors to the next generation, which is the cycle that a lot of clubs wanted to produce. And it's very important. On Kawasaki Frontale, for example, you can have a player like Kota Takai, defender, who's going to go to Europe. It's not a question of if, but when. And he's playing, with Akihiro Yanaga, I mentioned earlier, the midfielder, who is a super veteran and has, 2 J-League MVPs under his belt. And he was there for all of Kawasaki's titles. And he used to play for the national team. He used to play in Spain and that sort of thing. And he's there and he's found his groove in the J-League. And he played for a bunch of different clubs. Then he came back to Japan and has really found his home in Kawasaki. And so you look at who I'll send this and I, this is not a visual medium, so the users won't be able to see it, but the J League has its sort of season opening ticket giveaway thing, all the tickets that it's giving away this season. And you look at the top banner and who's at the front of this, and it's Yoshinori Muto, former national team player who played in Europe, and he's a veteran. Sho Sasaki, former national team player who's now a veteran at Sanfrecce. Yuma Suzuki, who was sort of the bad boy of Kashima Antlers, who would have played for the national team if he'd maybe learned to not slam his national team coach on social media every once in a while. Yuto Nagatomo, who is ageless, Shinji Kagawa, who was insane at Dortmund and went to, one of the first Japanese stars in the Premier League. These are not stars in the sense that they are national team stars, but this shows you where the J League is at. It's either the young kids or the old salty veterans.
I did not know that Shinji Kagawa was still playing. Yeah, that's wow.
He jumped around after he left Dortmund. He jumped around a couple clubs in Europe, and then he came back to ZSO, which is sort of his generation. When they went to Europe, they would go stand in front of the mic after the game and do the tearful farewell speech. And they always said, I'm going to go to Europe and become the best player that ever was, and then come back and help this club become stronger. And we always looked at that as sort of a problematic thing, because you had players who said, like, I'll be back. And the suggestion was, like, are you really in it to win it? Like, are you really going to go to Europe and be everything that you're capable of? And we saw so many players make that speech and flame out. But then there's been sort of this sea change over the last 5-6 years where players aren't saying that anymore. You know, they're thanking the club. They're obviously very grateful for the club, but they're not promising to come back. Takefusa Kubo did not promise to come back when he left FC Tokyo. I was at that stadium. Like, it shows a different mentality now, that you don't have players who are sort of focused on that, but when they turn 18 or when they turn 19 or when they turn 20, it's part of the journey now. It's not about going to Europe for a few years and then coming back to Japan. It's about, as a player, going to Europe and becoming the best. That's what they're trying to do. So I think that's very important in understanding how the mentality of Japanese players has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's super interesting. Yeah. Like I didn't realize that. I mean, it makes sense. Soccer in general, like a lot of places, like Europe is the goal, right? Like Europe is where you want to go, where you want to be as a rising star. That's the target.
That whole the era of like the Shinji Kagawa, I'm thinking of like the Shinji Okazaki, playing at Leicester, and like for me, one of the first really big Japanese players that I was like, oh, I need that jersey is Keisuke Honda when he was at AC Milan.
In my closet, I actually have one of his jerseys from when he was at CSKA Moscow.
Wow.
That was a bit of a pandemic purchase. All of us were sitting around and deciding we want to maybe collect a few uniforms. And so I picked that up. Honda is I mean, he's a weirdo. He is sort of amazing player who, you have to respect any player who can just bend gravity to his will like Honda did. But these days, he's much more, I mean, he hasn't officially retired. He did sign to not a Laotian team, it might have been a Laotian. He signed to some team in Southeast Asia on a one-day contract to help them in an AFC Champions Cup qualifier. He was shadow manager of Cambodia's national team while he was still playing in Australia. Like, we kind of call him the Elon Musk of Japanese soccer in that he's got like a VC startup fund with Will Smith. His big thing is he started a 4-on-4 under 10 futsal tournament because he's trying to help. And he's got a lot of corporate backers for this thing. And I think that's sort of where he's getting it. He's doing a lot of things. And he's a bit of a weirdo, but game recognized game. Like, you have to respect the skills that he brought. And you'll notice, like, he's a kind of player who, could he have gone back to the J-League and been a star? Absolutely. Does he want to? No, he'd rather keep up his image of being
business ventures.
Maya Yoshida could have gone back to the J-League. Instead, he decided on one last adventure overseas, and he went to LA Galaxy and won a chip with them, and he's still there. And like, I love it. I love getting emails from LA Galaxy's press team, and he's giving quotes after the game and that sort of thing. Like, you love to see Japanese players become faces of the team, which isn't something that you get often just because of the language barrier and that sort of thing.
So do you think that there is a team in the J-League? And again, there's with the tiers and everything like that, it's maybe hard to say just the J-League, but is there a team that everyone hates? Is there a team or a player where they're like, F that dude?
Okay, so Urawa have a bad rep because of the fans. Urawa's fans are known, I mean, I will give them all the credit in the world for having the best support in the league. They're also assholes. The problem with fandoms that are inspired by European culture is that sometimes they bring over the bad aspects of European culture. Gamba Osaka is on its third or fourth core active supporter group. The first one was disbanded after the big Saitama Stadium riot of 2008. The second one was disbanded 10 years later after the SS flag. The third one might have been suspended after someone threw a drumstick and it actually hit another fan. Every club has a few dumbasses in it, and some have had more than others. But like, because of Urawa's fans and the reputation that they try to build as a club, again, in many ways, Man United, more talk than trophies. In recent years, they tend to be everyone's sort of second least favorite team, if not least favorite.
Okay.
Last year, I'll tell you, Machida Zelvia picked up a lot of haters last year because they play a very cynical style of soccer, a lot of gamesmanship. Like, player on the other team is setting up for a penalty kick and someone splashes some water from the water bottle onto the ball. Like stuff like that. Like, really, like...
Chris Paul wiping his sweat on the ball as someone's trying to, like...
Yeah, like that's,
you know,
and it's like... It's funny because for many years there has been a debate over, does Japan have, and the Portuguese term is malicia, which doesn't mean malice, but it means sort of gamesmanship or cunning. And so there's always the question of, well, does Japan have enough cunning to get through to win internationally? Like, are the players sort of lagging behind the rest of the world because they are too honorable? Like, should players go down more easily if they're tackled from behind? That sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, this team shows up and they're giving a university lecture on militia and everyone gets big mad. So part of what's interesting about Japanese soccer is that you have all these different cultural elements and sometimes they clash. I mean, the J.League is one of the only leagues in the world where the teams have to go and greet their supporters after the game. You know, you watch a Premier League game, they'll stand around the center circle and do a clap and whatever. J-League teams, they will go and bow to every section of their stadium and then go behind this in front of the active support and bow. And then they'll go to the main stand and then bow to the supporters on that side. Home or away, doesn't matter. They have to do it. You know, like that's just the culture.
Wow.
And if you had a bad result, if you sucked and you have to stand there and get booed and take it.
Mm.
Huh.
That's super interesting, you know, because in a couple of things you said there, one kind of taking Urara, you know, fans and taking those things from Europe and the ultras culture, especially from Italy, you know, but from all sorts of leagues. But, you know, I think of Italy being one of the most, you know, infamous, having this big ultras culture. So that's interesting. But another thing you mentioned is the national team. The Samurai Blue, right? And over the past few years has really become, you know, if you look at these past few World Cups, have really become kind of a team that people love to root for.
And that's a wrap on part 1 of our Japanese soccer deep dive. Thank you so much for tuning in and kicking it with us. A huge shout out to Dan Orlowitz for joining us and dropping knowledge bombs like a seasoned midfield maestro. Whether you're now a newly minted fan of the J-League, or you've already been cheering for your favorite team in the stands, we hope you learned something new, and maybe even found a new favorite team or player. But remember, we're only at halftime here. Next time, in part 2, Dan will be back, and we're going to take this conversation global, diving into Japan's national teams, World Cup moments, youth development, and how Japanese soccer is evolving on an international stage. Trust me, if you enjoyed this conversation, you'll definitely like the next one, I promise. But in the meantime, check out some of Dan's work and learn a little bit more while you wait. We'll have everything linked out in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode or any of our past episodes, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show. Every single one of those 5-star ratings and reviews helps others discover the Krewe of Japan and continue to grow our global crew. Or hey, share this episode with your fellow footy fan, language learners, or anyone who thinks Kashima Antlers sounds like a reindeer punk band. By the way, you're not wrong. Any and all support is incredibly appreciated. Are you a fan of the J-League? Let us know. Share your fandom and experiences with us on social media. Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. Just search Krewe of Japan Podcast to stay in the loop with all of our future episodes, upcoming Japan Society events, and Japan-related content. That's KREWEOFJAPAN, Krewe of Japan. Or maybe you want to send us an email. That's cool too. kreweofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. But that's it for this part of our soccer deep dive and this week's episode. Until next time. Looking to start your own podcast and don't know what platform to use? Tell me about it. When we started the Krewe of Japan podcast, we tried a bunch of the big name recording platforms, but always came back to the one we're still currently using to this day, Zencastr. Zencastr is now the all-in-one solution making podcasting easy. In addition to its high audio and video quality for podcast production, Zencastr provides a full suite of production tools to record, produce, and publish studio quality content from the comfort of your home. Just log in through your browser and start recording. It's that simple. For us, we simply send out links to our guests and they join the lobby. But before you know it, it's all done and you have your studio quality audio and up to 4K video right there ready for you right when you finish. The best part is having their multi-layered backups to ensure that your recordings are in the highest quality, regardless of anyone's internet connection stability. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcasts in one place and distribute to all the major destinations. It's really that easy. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our code KREWOFJAPAN, KREWEOFJAPAN, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencastr paid plan. We want you to have the same easy experiences we do for all of our podcasting and content needs. It's your time to share your story.